Okay, let's be honest. Which would you rather have? Jesus' list of blessings or his list of woes? I mean, think about it. On the one hand, there's poverty, hunger, grief, and persecution. Believe it or not, these are what Jesus calls blessings. On the other hand, there's wealth, abundance, laughter, and esteem. Even more disturbing, these are what Jesus calls woes. Really? Is Jesus actually telling us that we are meant to prefer the second set of options to the first? I don't think so. And yet it's true that many of the things we most desire can create real problems in our relationship with God if we let them, while many of the things that we most dread can open us to God, again, if we let them. Wealth, comfort, and privilege can leave us complacent and self-satisfied. They can instill in us a false sense of security, a false sense of our own invulnerability, while deprivation and loss can open our eyes to injustice, can open our hearts to compassion and empathy. Neither of these two outcomes has to be the case. And yet, there's a distinct tendency in that direction. At the heart, then, of Jesus's list of blessings and woes is a question. Jesus is asking each of us, what do you tend to build your life upon? What is it that you most trust? Is it money? Is it abundance? Is it power and position in society? Are these what you're relying on to get you through? Is it these that you're depending on to get you over life's rough spots? Because sooner or later, each of these will let you down. They can only go so far. Rather, it is trust in God that will carry you through. As it says in Jeremiah, blessed are those who trust in the Lord, who trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. Not that this means that you have to only trust in God for all things to go well. Not at all. It doesn't work that way. It means instead that whether rich or poor, whether sated or hungry, whether laughing or grieving, whether esteemed or rejected, with God as your beacon, you will persevere. You will thrive. You will make it through because you'll know that God is with you. The key here is radical acceptance, a willingness to embrace everything that comes your way. Of course, you can change something that's less than ideal. If you can change something that's less than ideal, you do. But given all those things outside our control, and there are so many, to be able to receive events without fighting becomes critical. This is the point. Blessed is the person who can live every moment fully, Jesus is saying. Every moment in all its ups and all its downs, accepting each in turn for what it is, not looking away from hardships, but simply taking them in stride with all the rest. Such a response requires tremendous spiritual maturity, of course. And yet, I believe that it is this very lesson that we're here on earth to learn. You know, recently I've been reading a remarkable book called Uninterrupted Life. It's the diary of an extraordinary young woman named Eddie Hillesum. Eddie which is short for Esther, was a Dutch Jew. Born in 1914, Eddie got a degree in law in 1932, then stayed on to study Slavonic languages, except that, as the title of her book says, hers was an interrupted life. The diary, which she began when she was 27, deals with the years 1941 to 1943. Those were the years when her country was occupied by the Nazis. The result is rather like a more complex and sophisticated Anne Frank. It is also a brilliant spiritual document. In the introduction, Jan Garland calls it, quote, one of the most remarkable texts of our time, a testament of faith and love written in the darkest hours of modern history, unquote. Eddie began her diary as something of a free thinker. She half jokingly described herself as, quote, a girl who cannot kneel, unquote. And yet, little by little, her intense longing for something more, combined with her passionate love of life, began to win out. In August 1941, she writes, quote, there is a really deep well inside of me. In it dwells God. Sometimes I am there too, but more often stones and grit block the well and God is buried beneath. Then he must be dug out again, unquote. Increasingly, though, she began to address God directly in her diary. She speaks always of a thread of meaning that she constantly finds in even her most difficult struggles. For example, in November of that same year, she writes, quote, God, take me by your hand. I shall follow you dutifully and not resist too much. I shall evade none of the tempest of life which in store for me. I shall try to face it all as best I can. I shall accept all the invisible tumult and struggle. I delight in warmth and security, but I shall not rebel if I have to suffer cold, should you so decree. I shall follow wherever your hand leads me, and shall try not to be afraid. And I shall try to spread more of my warmth, my genuine love of others. For I know that I must seek you among people out into the world, unquote. In April of 1942, the Nazis began their first large-scale roundup of Jews in Holland. In September 4th of that year, Eddie volunteered. She volunteered to be among the first to be sent to a labor camp. Then 10 days later, the love of her life was further disrupted with the sudden death of the man who had been the love of her life. He collapsed of a heart attack when the Gestapo came to take him away. Think of it. Here she was with so much loss, with so much suffering, with so much grief. And yet on that very day, Eddie wrote in her diary, quote, perhaps, oh God, everything happening together like that was a little hard. And yet, I now realize, God, how much you have given me. So much that was beautiful and so much that was hard to bear. To think that one small human heart can experience so much, oh God, so much suffering and so much love. I am grateful to you, God, for having chosen my heart in these times to experience all these things it has experienced, unquote. Here was a person who placed trust in God at the center of her life, and in so doing, something remarkable happened. She went hungry and felt blessed. blessed that she could share her people's struggle. She grieved, and she felt blessed that she had loved. She experienced hardship and felt her life rich with meaning. She was persecuted and felt only love of others. Was this what Jesus was pointing to in his Beatitudes? Etty Hillesum spent her last weeks supporting people who had been facing deportation to Auschwitz. Finally, suddenly one morning, her turn came too. Her last written words came, believe it or not, from a postcard addressed to friends and thrown from a train on her way to Auschwitz. On it, she had scrawled, quote, "In the end, the departure came without warning. We left the camp singing, 'We shall be traveling 3 days. Thank you for all your kindness and care,'" unquote. It's true. Etty actually went to her death singing. It seems almost too much, doesn't it? And not only that, her final words were to thank others for their kindness and care. Are such things even possible? The fact is, in her short life, Etty experienced very little of what Jesus calls woes. Very little wealth, comfort, or esteem, and far more of what he calls blessings, poverty, sorrow, obscurity, and persecution. Those of life's struggles which are neither earned nor make sense. What Etty herself calls God's ultimate mysteries. And yet, against all odds, hers was not a life of disappointment, sadness, or regret, but one of love, beauty, meaning, and worth. It seems incredible, doesn't it? Such courage. And yet, for Etty, it wasn't even that. She simply trusted God. With this as her foundation, all the rest followed naturally. As she writes in one of her diary's last entries, quote, "I am not afraid to look suffering straight in the eyes. And at the end of each day, there is always the feeling, I love people so much." Never any bitterness about what was done to them, but always love for those who knew how to bear so much, unquote. What do you think? Was Jesus right? Was this life blessed? For me, I believe it was. Truly, it was. Amen.